Today, I'm joined by Brad Rowland of the Locked On Hawks podcast to discuss if Atlanta could be better than New York this year. Is it a make or break season for Trae Young? And how would Atlanta have to rebuild this team around Young if they're not great this season? All that and more right now on Locked On Knicks.
You are Locked On Knicks, your daily New York Knicks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Knicks, your daily New York Knicks podcast, and today's episode is brought to you by Jace Medical. Empower yourself when you purchase a Jace case, providing you with a personal supply of 5 antibiotics that treat 50-plus infections. Get yours today at jacemedical.com. That's JASE medical.com. And I wanted to thank you for becoming an everydayer, because that means you've subscribed and hit that notifications bell on YouTube. If you haven't done so, please do so and do the same on the audio side. Now you can text us by just clicking the subtext link in the episode description whenever you want, and we'll send you a bunch of texts with our latest thoughts on the Knicks. Before we get into it with Brad, small note, I was having some major internet issues during this episode. So there's going to be a couple of times where I'm talking and it cuts off a little bit, or Brad's talking and you see me frozen in an extremely stupid face, which should be an encouragement for all of you to watch on YouTube because it's very funny. On the audio side, you shouldn't notice too much because I went back in and fixed it. But if you're watching on YouTube, just a heads up that I will probably be frozen with a stupid face, but it only affected a couple small parts of the episode. So without further ado, this is a really fun conversation. We talk about the Knicks and their most hated rival, Trae Young, right now on Locked On Knicks. And as promised, we are joined by the fantastic Brad Rowland, the host of the Locked On Hawks podcast. Brad, we were just commiserating over what a long, relatively boring offseason it's been for both the Knicks and Hawks, but that will change shortly as training camp about to get underway for both teams. Really big season for the Knicks. I would argue maybe even greater stakes for the Hawks this year. Let's just start as broadly as possible. First full year under Quin Snyder. I've seen a lot of hype for Atlanta around the internet. I know Zach Lowe's really high on them this year. I've seen a couple of other big names just kind of say like, hey, Hawks are kind of a dark horse to be top 4, 5, or 6 seed. At least on our pod, we haven't really considered that possible. We're talking about the best teams in the East. What do you think are reasonable expectations for this year?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because like even people that are high on the Hawks, like I think Zach, you mentioned Zach Lowe, like he's almost made it a bid at this point. Like I don't think he even believes it all the way through. But no, it's one of those things where I think the Hawks should be better than they were a year ago. And that is the baseline expectation. Now, what that actually means is interesting because, you know, internally they want to be a top 6 seed. I mean, that's going to be the goal for every team in this range is going to be, hey, we want to be a non-play-in team. But for this Hawks team, after the last 2 years of being in the play-in with high expectations, they're going to hope and bank on being better than that. I agree with that focus. Whether they're going to be the 6 seed, 7 seed, 8 seed, whatever it's going to be is kind of, you know, interesting to me. I would lean to like improvement from last year. I do think the coaching upgrade certainly is going to help them, but I also don't think that you would reasonably put them in the top 3 or 4 either. But even then, like there's probably more uncertainty at the top than there was this time a year ago with teams like Milwaukee and Boston made changes and Philly's got all the uncertainty. So it feels like super wide open. And I think maybe the Hawks are going to talk themselves into that being some optimism for them too.
Yeah, it really, I mean, it's something we've been doing these previews all around the Eastern Conference. And I know we talked to John Corrales, and he's pretty confident that Boston's going to end up being the 1 or 2 seed at the end of this year. I think with the baked-in injury risk for Kristaps Porzingis and them maybe leaning a little bit further into Missoula ball, that could be a good or bad thing. Milwaukee, obviously, they have the Chris Middleton issue. I'd be shocked if they fell out of the top 2 or 3. But Philly, such a big question mark. Obviously, Cleveland, really, really good, but can they sustain it year over year? Like, there's a world, like you could tell me, we've talked about on the show, where the Knicks are the 2 seed or Atlanta is the 3 seed. And I wouldn't say that. I'd say those are more like 10 to 15% possibilities than like 1% possibilities. What does it look like if everything works for Atlanta this year? Like if they hit their ceiling, what has to happen?
I think the simple explanation is essentially an elite offense, which they have been for large swaths the last couple of years, but also elite offense and not terrible defense, if that makes sense. I think their entire kind of theory of the case right now with this roster and with Trae Young and all that is to build a great offense and just hope to be good enough defensively. And last year they weren't as good as they wanted to be on offense. And they also were pretty bad defensively. I think they do think that they kind of found their stride offensively when Quin Snyder got there. That would be very helpful. But at the same time, I do think that like if it all comes together, you're looking at a situation where they are, I don't know, top 5 offense and like the, 18th defense, something like that. And that would be a translation to be like a, high 40s kind of win team, maybe even low 50s if things, that's kind of the best case, reasonable scenario. Obviously Hawks fans will want to see even better than that because that's the nature of fandom, but you know what I mean? Like, I think awesome offense, and then you just hope for a top 20 defense to kind of piece it together.
And what do you think the difference having a full year under Quin Snyder makes? I mean, top 5 offense, that is kind of the first thing I would look towards. Obviously in Utah, like he kind of created magic around Donovan Mitchell. I mean, you saw the talent level on that team, and it didn't scream best offense in basketball or top 3 offense in basketball year after year. And they always seem to be in that mix. I would argue Atlanta is, at least on paper, almost better positioned. And maybe a lot of it comes down to what we're going to talk about in a second, which is how Trae Young does and how he fits in with Dejounte Murray. But it feels like they could have that ceiling if everything clicks. Quin Snyder is just that good of an offensive coach. Yeah,
I mean, number one, Snyder is really good, and number two, like this Hawks team they were top 2 or 3 in the league 2 years ago in offense with a roster that isn't much different. I mean, there's been some mild changes on the margins, but the formula is still the same of playing through Trae Young and having a pick and roll big and having hopefully some more shooting around him. Last year, one of their deficits, not to go crazy deep in the Hawks, but they didn't have enough shooting last year. They just didn't have enough shooting. And if you're going to build your team around offense, you got to have shooting, and they didn't have enough of it. So I do think that the combination of a roster that's proven, a star that, while it's certainly controversial, I think hopefully people can agree Trae Young is an awesome offensive player, an awesome creator, one of the best individual creators, pick and roll creators in the league. Having that guy and enough pieces around him and a coach who I think the generous way that I've put it recently is like a little bit more modern in approach than what Nate McMillan was doing previously, when I think he was not maximizing the talent that they had. So I think obviously we haven't seen it on a large scale yet, but I do think that Quin Snyder and his history that you point to with Utah, I made the same comparison. Like the roster and the talent was not, you could argue maybe it was a little bit better in Utah, but it was not demonstrably better than what he has in Atlanta. And they were a perennial, 48-52 kind of win team with good offenses. And yeah, they had Rudy Gobert and anchor the defense. That definitely matters. But they were able to build good offenses, even with talent that was, again, like not out of this world. And I think, Trae Young, you could argue might be the best piece he's ever had at the point of attack, just on offense. Mitchell is really good too. But it's interesting to kind of see all those pieces together. But he's, of course, the key to everything. Even though there are other X factors for sure. But Trae Young is going to get all the attention for better or worse. And he's very good. So that's very helpful.
So I have a weird relationship with Trae Young because obviously he's a villain
yes.
to the Knicks fandom to an almost absurd extent where I think both sides are guilty of it. Like I think not even just Hawks fans, but NBA fans in general, kind of like every time Trae plays the Knicks, it feels like that is a disproportionately large storyline. And my concern with him was always, do his teammates like him? Do they like playing with him? And I always go back to his time at Oklahoma, where he was a freshman and he came in and he was this incredible phenom, was like leading the country in scoring, was leading the country in assists, was carrying Oklahoma to win after win. And I felt like everyone on the team was just annoyed by this. I don't know if this is an appropriate term, but I'm going to say a virtuoso pipsqueak that was taking every shot, controlling every possession. And in some ways it feels like that's almost translated to the NBA, where he is undeniably a basketball genius and a brilliant passer at that, and yet it sometimes feels like his teammates don't love playing with him. I wonder if last year exacerbated those feelings at all, given that it was one of the least efficient years of his career. But all that being said, under Quin Snyder, I feel like he has a chance to have somewhat of a comeback year, have a monster season. I guess I don't even know what my question is, but what's the vibe like around Trae Young at this point? Like, is it optimism? Is it pessimism? Where are you at with him?
It's really interesting. Like, I think that, and I made this point on my show, and look, I'm not seen, especially locally, I'm not like a zealot. Like I'm not a super fanboy. That's kind of, I have a reputation for being pretty negative sometimes, or maybe not necessarily negative, like skeptical. I try to be a little bit more kind of detached. And like, I feel like Trae Young is underrated now nationally. And that surprises me because, usually a guy who is 6'1", doesn't really play a lot of defense and averages the numbers that he averages. And I'm someone who values defense. Like, that guy is almost set up to be overrated, like as a default, because, huge numbers, doesn't, all that stuff. And I feel like in not every circle, like some people were more reasonable about it, but like I see him get ranked in like the 30s and 40s in these top 100 rankings. And like, it feels like it's almost gone too far. And I get the skepticism. Look, it is tough to build around that guy. I will certainly grant that. If it was a vacuum situation, you can pick whatever you want. I would not want to start my team with a 6'1" point guard who is not a very good defender. It would be tough to do that at the highest level. But he's the best player they've had in a long, long time. And this is what they've done. And that makes a lot of sense through that prism. And like, yeah, I think that his rep is probably worse than it should be. I think that he had some trouble as a young guy playing with teammates. I think not everyone loves playing with him. I will grant that. I think there are guys, though, that get along well with Trae. Like, I don't think he's this like super negative locker room presence or this. I also think he's actually matured quite a bit, even with the media, which doesn't really matter. You know this. Like, he's gotten a lot more like introspective and like he'll take accountability in a way he didn't used to when he was a young player. That kind of thing. Like, you just see the growth every day of watching this guy. So, long story short, I think that he's really good in offense. I think he has improved in some certain categories, but even last year, I would call it a down year for him by his standards. And now that's impressive when like you still look at what he was able to do both on the court with the team and also his performance. Like, he was still a really good player, but it was not a great year for him. And he has to be better for the Hawks to be where they want to be. I think he acknowledges that. They acknowledge that. So like, I think it's weird, honestly, the discourse around him. I'm sure it's even weirder in New York where you talked about him being the villain and all that stuff. That's kind of funny. I think he leaned into it too, admittedly. Like, he won on WWE, all those things like made it a bigger deal than it probably needed to be. But I think that it's kind of weird, like how much it's gone the other way. I would have guessed that he would always be probably overrated. And I feel like it's not necessarily the case right now, which maybe that comes with back-to-back play-in teams and him being the best player on those teams and kind of just getting, some people just dismiss him as this like, yeah, he's just a guy. And like, I think he's not just a guy. He's really good. It's just that he has weaknesses and places that you wouldn't necessarily want to build around.
Yeah, I think it's funny because whenever we and we've had plenty of time to talk about this offseason, so we've done it a bunch of times. All right, where does Jalen Brunson rank amongst all the point guards in the NBA? My random like having Brunson like the higher Tyrese Halliburton, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, and I kind of go like, all right, well, wake me up when those guys have put up like 37, 6 and 6 in 3 essentially do or die games against the Miami Heat. But I can't say that about Trae Young. Like, he did it at MSG, did it against the Knicks. He did it against the Sixers team that was imploding, but still had Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons on it. And then that series against Milwaukee was closer in some ways than I think some people remember with a bunch of injuries, including Trae and Giannis on both sides. But we don't have to go back because that was a dark time for Knicks fans. But anyways, I say that to say like proof of concept, like he got his team to the Final Four. And if you're the best player on a Final Four team, those guys are extraordinarily hard to find. And presumably that was at this point 2 bordering on 3 seasons ago. You would expect him to be even better, and you'd expect him to be able to do that again. Whether he can do that with Dejounte Murray, let's get into that in just a sec. But before we do, I wanted to talk about some of our best friends on this podcast, our buddies over at FanDuel Sportsbook. And man, the games are going on right now, so I'm into it. Snap into the action this NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets, whether you win or lose. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action. The app is so easy to use. There's a wide range of betting options, including spreads, player props, over-unders, and so much more. I've been looking at those NBA over-unders. My Knicks, we've been insulted. 44.5 is the line for the Knicks. I think that is way too low. They won more games last year. They should be better this season. So I am all in on that. The Atlanta Hawks, 41.5, maybe a little bit of disrespect there as well. If you expect them to be better this year, they will certainly do better than that. So whether you're a Knicks fan, whether you're a Hawks fan, you can go on FanDuel. You can prove those haters in Vegas wrong. And if you want to do that, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off both the NFL and the NBA season. FanDuel, official partner of the NFL. All right, let's keep it going. Trae Young, Dejounte Murray. Match made in heaven. On paper, some people thought last season, some real questions offensively. Defensively, I was all in on, wow, that's so smart. Dejounte is going to cover up for Trae. It's going to get Trae off the ball a little bit more, maybe especially once Quin took over. He's going to lean in a little bit more into being his inner Steph Curry and operate as a massive, massive magnet drawing the attention off of defenses, and you hear the ambulances going by, rad, because it didn't work out that way. It wasn't a disaster that would necessitate an emergency vehicle, but I don't think it was quite as clean as people in Atlanta probably hoped. What are fair expectations for this season for the duo? And what are kind of the key things that they have to figure out?
I think it would be fair to say it didn't go the way they thought it was going to go. And I'm glad you also clarified it wasn't a disaster. It's like, it'd be easier to talk about if it just completely not worked. And, let's just light this thing on fire and start over again kind of thing. And, it's more nuanced than that. Like, the numbers were not great when they played together, but they were pretty good. The problem, honestly, was that they still had the same problem that they've always had with Trae. When he leaves the court, they couldn't sustain it. And part of the theory of the case, I'm sure my listeners will probably laugh at when I say this again, was that the Hawks brought in Murray not only to play with Trae, but also to have a team that could actually function with Trae off the court. And that theory did not work at all. They were still terrible when he left the floor all the time, basically. And then also defensively, Dejounte was not the guy that they thought he was going to be. And maybe he will be in year two. But he took a real step down from where he was a couple of years ago in San Antonio. I was kind of hearing that from Spurs fans. I don't know how plugged in you are on the Spurs last couple of years. I'm sure not as much as some, including me. But I was asking around, like, hey, how's DeJounte's defense? And people who cover Spurs were like, kind of, it's not great anymore. Like, he's not a stopper like he used to be. And that was certainly showing up on tape. So that's number one for me, which is kind of weird, I'm sure, to hear if you're a Knicks fan. Like, my number one talking point is defense with Trae and Dejounte. But they got to be better defensively, because the Hawks, no matter what happens, they can't be as bad as they were at the point of attack last year defensively, or nothing else matters. They were that bad where you can't cover it up. So that's number one. But offensively, I think, not to put it all on Quin Snyder, but I think having a guy who's a little bit more innovative, puts guys in positions to succeed, and has experience playing with, Mitchell and Conley, for instance, in Utah, a couple of point guards, or at least point guard adjacent players playing together, smaller guys. And, it's not like an easy fit like a glove kind of thing with Trae and Dejounte, but they both have strengths and weaknesses. I think more 3-point shooting, both from those guys and also around them, more space in general, more pace from Quin will all help. But it's obviously a very clear thing to say, and a sort of a Captain Obvious thing, but they have to be good together, or it doesn't matter. Like, they traded so much for Murray that if this doesn't work again in year two, by the way, they also paid Murray in the offseason, which we should also point out. It was a deal that everybody, even if you don't love Murray, it was kind of a bargain contract. Like, I was surprised he signed it. Everybody kind of was surprised he signed it, but they also invested in him for 4 years. So it's a high wire act. They're not all in, but they're definitely getting towards that with this group. So we'll see is the not sexy answer at all, but it has to work, or it's not going to work big picture.
And I guess I want to get to that big picture. Like, what happens? We talked about the best case scenario for Atlanta. What happens if things, I don't even want to say are a disaster, because I think unless, like, same caveat you could have for every team, unless there are major injuries, like, that's not going to happen. I think at the very least, they're going to play around 500 basketball. But if it's the third straight year of, all right, maybe they take the Celtics to 6 games, they take the Bucks to 6 games, like whatever it is in the first round, if that happens again, and it's just pretty clear, like, all right, the outline of this team, whether it's Trae, Bogdanovich, Capella, DeAndre Hunter, is kind of tapped out. Does that mean Trae's gone? Does that mean everyone around him is gone? Like, what would happen the following offseason if it's kind of just a deja vu year for Atlanta?
Yeah, I think part of that nuance is, like, is it a 4-5 series they lose? Like, if they're the 5 seed and they lose in the first round, that's a step forward. It's not great, but it's a step forward. You know what I mean? If they win 47 games, lose in the first round, like that, no one will be happy with that. But I could frame that as a step in the right direction. If they are in the play-in again and lose as the 8th seed again, then the alarm bells really start going off. Like, okay, this experiment is not necessarily failed, but they're going to have to make more major changes, because look, the Hawks didn't really do much of anything this offseason. They made one trade, and it actually made them worse. They traded John Collins for money reasons and fit reasons, for sure. And John wasn't a great fit, but he's a good basketball player, and they traded him for nothing. And that doesn't usually make you better. Now, obviously, they have some young guys coming up, Jalen Johnson, AJ Griffin, Sadiq Bey, all these guys. But to answer your question, I think, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I've ever heard, Trae is not going to be in any danger of being shipped out unless he demands to be, which you know this very well, monitoring the league. Guys can usually get out. They don't always get out right away. We've seen that now with Dame. We've seen that now with Harden. But guys will usually make their way out within a year if they want to make it public anyway. But short of that, I'd be surprised, and this could change. I'm not saying it couldn't. I'd be surprised if the Hawks were looking to trade Trae Young unless he wanted to be traded at any point in the near future. So there's that. I think if it were to not go well this year for non-injury reasons, I think you'd see on the margins changes. You'd see maybe Dejounte would be available next summer, that kind of thing. More big picture. Capella and Bogdanovich are the older guys on this team, but I think it'd be a more clear overhaul around Trae, unless Trae made noise that he wanted out. Again, I'm not saying every month or so we get a Lakers interested in Trae Young report, and it's just like until that happens, it happens. But for now, as on the Hawks side, I'd be surprised if they want to trade Trae. It would be more, though, again, like either more aggressive to push in, like we saw Siakam rumors this offseason. That would have been a much bigger move. Something like that, going the other way, go even further in, or maybe a retooling on the margins. I'm not really sure which one of those it would be, but I still think it would be Trae, and then everything around Trae is what kind of goes into flux.
So you took the words out of my mouth. Could the Siakam thing still happen this year? I mean, because obviously Atlanta was the name that was thrown out there, and to me, from a Knicks perspective, like where my concern about Atlanta as a Knicks opponents would escalate if all of a sudden, oh wow, Trae Young and Pascal Siakam, and two guys that can kill you in a 7-game series and are exceptionally talented. Like you throw Dejounte into that mix, all of a sudden, like you look at the top 3 for the Knicks and the top 3 for the Hawks, and you'd say, all right, the Hawks like have better frontline talent than we've seen the Knicks. Whatever you think about the Cavs, like maybe able to overcome that. And like, I think that would be a great series, but that at least in my mind for the Knicks and maybe even for some other teams in the East would change the equation. But where is that at? And I guess what were kind of the breaking points and if there were talks and they did get advanced there?
Yeah. I mean, part of it is that Siakam is making it known to everyone, either him or his camp, that he doesn't really want to be traded. And it's kind of the opposite of Harden and Dame, whereas like your star is like really getting it out there, like even to people like me who are not like the leading, you know what I mean? Like I heard multiple sources like, hey, he doesn't want to be traded, and not just to Atlanta. It wasn't just Atlanta. Like he wants to stay in Toronto. And if you're telling everyone, A, I don't want to be traded, and B, I won't sign an extension if you trade for me, teams are going to not give up as much as the Raptors want for him. So that's the big picture of why it didn't happen. The Hawks also kind of maybe drew the line in the sand, which they should. I mean, he's got 1 year left on his contract, and with all the stuff I just said about not wanting to re-sign necessarily, and look, do I think he probably would re-sign if they traded for him? Yeah, I kind of do. Like most of the time, guys sign with the team that they're already on because they get more money. It is what it is. But if you don't have that assurance, and in fact, you have the opposite of that assurance if you're the Hawks, you kind of have to draw the line and say, all right, this is our best offer. We're not going any further, and that wasn't enough for Toronto. And that makes sense on all sides. I kind of get it. Like the Raptors it's not a Raptors podcast. I don't really know what they're doing directionally. I don't really understand the Raptors as a general process right now, but they don't want to trade Siakam. And I get that. He's an all-star. He's an all-star level player. He's really good. Could it happen again? Yeah, sure. I mean, if Toronto lowers their asking price, or if Siakam's side maybe stops being so firm and not wanting to be traded, or the Raptors are just bad early in the year and they just kind of wave the white flag finally and kind of trade everybody, or the Hawks trade more and they get more desperate. All those things could happen. And, as soon as things kind of cooled down in like mid-late July, it was really hot for like a week, maybe 2 weeks. And then once it didn't happen, I'm like, this probably won't happen. And if it does, it's going to be maybe into the season or maybe into training camp. So we're kind of back in the range where it could happen again. I just don't think that – I think it would have already happened if it was going to happen during the summer. But again, if Toronto's not very good, they should be more active to trade him. And I think the Hawks, if they're playing well, are still active in trying to quote-unquote buy to make themselves better. Because I think they know deep down this team right now is not a contender. If you add Siakam, you could talk yourself into that. I'm not saying that they would immediately become that, but that's at least a move that says, hey, we're going to go get another top 25, top 30 guy in the league on this team. That would be obviously a big signal.
Yeah, and I think that's the luxury of having Trae, is that you have a guy you can always talk yourself into, like, hey, if he's hot for the right 5-game stretch, he could be the best player in any series. And that's kind of been the brilliance of Miami.
We've seen it.
Who has a very different infrastructure, obviously. But Jimmy Butler, like regular season, you would have him, like you were talking about player ratings, you would probably have him in the 30s based on just his, or 20s is probably more reasonable, like based on what he does in the regular season. And then the playoffs, like he could be the best guy against almost anyone in the league, as it turns out, which is pretty incredible. And an asset that, like, if you have that in your possession, you can always kind of say, like, what the hell? Like, let's like, I don't care how small the odds are. Let's shoot our shot here. And I think Atlanta could get to that point this year, especially with the uncertainty heading into future seasons, especially if there's a slow start to the year. The other thing that really interests me with Atlanta is some of the younger guys. AJ Griffin was someone I remember last offseason from a Knicks perspective, we were talking about a whole lot. New York kid from Archbishop Stepinac in Westchester. And every expectation I had for him as a rookie, like it's hard to say he blew it out of the water because he just didn't play enough. But when he was on the court, like the talent was just obvious. And you know better than I do, Brad. He's someone I'm super high on. Where does he fit into the mix? Where does Jalen Johnson fit into the mix? With some really good flashes. Where does Kobe Buffkin, who, based on what you said and based on what I've heard, like obviously I don't think ultimately held up a Pascal Siakam trade, but I know that was a note that was out there. Yeah. So where do all these young guys kind of fit into the mix for Atlanta this year?
For sure. I mean, number one, Griffin, I'm with you. I like AJ quite a bit. That was a heist in the draft. He only fell that far because of injury concerns. And, you know, knock on wood, his rookie year, there were no injury concerns. And that's great. It's 1 year, but it's great. He was able to play without really any questions. And that's fantastic. Also, he's that archetype of like, he's not a super athletic guy for a wing, but he's 6'6", 6'7". He's got bulk, potential for two-way. He can shoot. Like, he checks all those boxes that every team wants on the wing. He'll play a big role this year. Probably, I mean, he's going to be off the bench, but certainly an evolving role. And Jalen Johnson's a guy that might even start for them at some point this year. I don't know if he's going to start opening night because they have Sadiq Bey too. But those two guys, I've often said that for them to hit their ceiling, like 2 years from now, if they don't make another big move for a Siakam or something like that and kind of roll with this team, they need one of them, maybe even both of those guys, to really kind of pop and take a next step. And that's not fair to them, but it's just what it is. It's you kind of just need that internal guy to jump. And I like Griffin probably the most, but Johnson's talent as a 6'10" guy who can, you know, dribble and pass and defend and fly up and down the court and all that stuff. He's a very, very attractive player, and they'll both play real roles this year. Buffkin, you mentioned Buffkin is like that. I think he was not the hold up in a Raptors trade. That kind of got floated out there. The Hawks didn't want to trade him. I mean, they just drafted the guy. I mean, that's not a huge surprise. You take a guy at 15, you usually like the guy that you just drafted. Yeah. And I think it was more of a case of like, they were already offering AJ Griffin, which was a lot for the Hawks to offer in their mind. And they were like, no, you can't have both of Griffin and Buffkin, if that makes sense. That's what I understand. I'm not reporting that. That's my guess on the outside.
Yeah. It was very similar last where we had the Donovan Mitchell stuff and everyone's like, wow, you won't trade Quentin Grimes for Donovan Mitchell? LOL. And it's like, no, we won't trade Quentin Grimes and 9 picks for Donovan Mitchell. But yeah, sorry.
That's exactly it. I mean, I'm sure if the deal was DeAndre Hunter and Kobe Buffkin for Pascal Siakam, and that was it, they would have done it. Sure. But maybe I shouldn't say I'm sure. I believe that would have happened if that was the deal. With you. So it wasn't like they were just saying you cannot have Kobe Buffkin. Anyway, I like Kobe Buffkin a lot, but as a rookie, is he going to play much? Probably not, unless there's an injury to Dejounte or even Trae or something like that. There just aren't like clear pathway to minutes for a guy like that. And you know this, rookies are not good usually. Occasionally a guy will be good, but for a team that's trying to win now, like the Knicks and like the Hawks, who are like, this is not development time anymore for these teams necessarily. The gifted minutes that, you know, the Hawks, I just covered a Hawks rebuild for several years, and like first round picks were just gifted minutes. Like, here's 30 minutes, do whatever you're going to do. That time is long gone now. Like, that's not going to happen. And I think Buffkin might not, he wouldn't embarrass himself if he had to play now. But I think if you look up and down the roster, even guys like, they got Patty Mills on this team now. Is Patty Mills great? No, but Patty Mills is a professional basketball player. Like, you'd probably trust Patty Mills. Wes Matthews is a different player. He's more of a wing, obviously, but you know, they got Bogey, they got Griffin, they got all these guys that are kind of ahead of him. So young guys are going to matter, I think, long-term especially, but even this year, you'll see Griffin especially and Johnson play real roles. And I keep saying their forward positions, like the 3 and the 4, are the under-discussed nationally about this Hawks team. That's what's going to actually make or break this team, in my opinion. Like, we can talk about Trae all day long, or talk about Capella or Dejounte. If they don't get anything from DeAndre Hunter or Johnson or Griffin or Sadiq Bey, then they, you know, that's 2 spots that they have a lot of uncertainty with. So they're going to have to get something from those guys. They're all fairly young, 25 or younger pretty much. And I keep circling that quartet of players, Hunter, Bey, Griffin, and Johnson, as like a pretty interesting pivot point for this team.
I remember, obviously, it was a pick after RJ when DeAndre Hunter was drafted. I was like, oh man, what a steal for Atlanta. Like, if you wanted to build an archetype for around Trae Young, right? You want this long-limbed, freakish defender who can shoot, create a little bit on the other end. Like, that's going to be a fun duo for years to come. And maybe some Knicks fans will get angry at me for saying this, but maybe similar to RJ, I feel like there have been moments, there have been flashes, there have been stretches where you're like, all right, like, this is like, and tell me if I'm wrong about this, but like this is kind of what we wanted from DeAndre Hunter. Like he's going to be that guy, but it's just never been consistent enough.
They kind of have to have more from Hunter, and it's one of those things where I don't want to make it as simple as this, but he has not been a starting level small forward on a good team to this point. Now he's been their starter for 3+ seasons at that spot, but he has not performed to that level to where if he wasn't a top 5 pick, if he wasn't someone they invested so heavily in, that they would have just rolled with him this entire time. I feel like he has been given a long leash, and look, he's not a bad player. He's not. But there's sort of a divide, I think, still ongoing between like what he actually is and what people think that he has been if they don't watch him every day, or if they see him on the right night and he makes his jump shots and he has 22 points in a playoff game or whatever. It's interesting to me, like there's a divide there between like what he actually is and what he maybe purports to be, or maybe people think that he is outside. But yeah, it's a big year for him. They already paid him, so that's something. There's gonna be pressure on him as someone who's already been extended at a real number, a starting money kind of number. And he's really important for them defensively because of, not to belabor the point, but they have all these guys who I would describe as probably below average, to be kind, perimeter defenders, and he kind of has to piece it all together. Him and Jalen Johnson are really the guys, and maybe Dejounte Murray, if he bounces back on that end of the floor, are really the guys that they're going to have to get more from, I should say, defensively, to make up for your Traes and your Bogdanoviches and your Sadiq Beys, and even Griffin probably at this point is a negative defender. So, I think that Hunter just needs to be out there, and like maybe he's never going to be this guy who creates a ton of havoc defensively. He's never going to be this guy who is a great passer, but making the simpler plays, maybe taking more threes, being more fun, kind of being more sound defensively, rebounding a little bit better, that kind of stuff, just kind of incremental improvements. And I think that he kind of is what he is. I think the breakout, given his age, is not going to happen at this point. But I think if he can kind of just prove to be a starting caliber small forward, that's kind of all he has to be, especially if that's sort of a defense first bent. Yeah, I think that eventually Okongwu is going to be a starting center for this team. That's not a huge surprise. I do think the way you kind of teed it up is funny, because Hawks fans have this battle, and I find myself defending Capella a lot because Capella is really good. That's the thing. Clint Capella is not an exciting player, but he's very good, and he's very well respected. He's a good defender. He's a great rebounder. Trae loves playing with him. Great screen setter. All those things. Like, he's just kind of boring. And Okongwu is the next thing. And he's really young, and he's really fun. And he's, by the way, importantly, very good. And they have 2 guys at this spot. And center's kind of the one spot on the court where like they can't really play together. It is what it is. And that kind of causes this friction between the two. Not between them, but because the fan base, when they talk about both these guys. So I think eventually Okongwu will be the guy. I think they're going to have to trade Capella for that to be the case, because they've invested in Capella, and like Capella's, it's going to sound weird, he's too good to come off the bench. Like, you can't realistically ask Clint Capella to come off the bench in his current form. Like, it's just not I guess he probably would do it. He's a great guy, but you know what I mean? Like, he's too good to do that. And I think that the way to pave the way for Okongwu is to trade Capella. And that's not a huge surprise. In fact, I've said this before, I'm kind of shocked that they're still both on the team heading into year 4 of Okongwu. When they drafted Okongwu, I would have been very, very surprised that to have this combination of Okongwu being good, which I think we already know he is good, and also having the fact that, Okongwu being good and the fact that Capella's still on the team in year 4 is like so weird to me. And that happened, and that's unfortunate for all parties involved, but there you go. And I think that it's a strength that they have. They're good. Having 2 guys is not a bad thing, but they have probably invested too much in that one spot, like objectively, to have a top 6 pick and a guy who's like a quality starting center in Capella. Eventually, they're gonna have to clear the decks. And again, I'm surprised it hasn't happened already, but eventually it's going to be Okongwu's job, whether it's by the deadline this year or whether it's next year or what. They're gonna have to trade Capella at some point, and it's coming.
All right, Brad. All that being said, win prediction for the Hawks this year, playoff finish, and we've thrown this one in just to create a little spice at the end. Prediction for season series against the Knicks. They play 3 games against each other this year.
46 wins is my guess, which might seem high. Their over-under is 41.5. I think I like the over. I'll say that. 40. I'm less confident on 46 than I am about liking the over on the Hawks win total. Combination of Snyder and all that stuff. Where that puts them in the East is probably like the 6 seed, 7 seed, something like that. 6 seed. Could be as high as 4 or 5. Wouldn't surprise me. Top 3 would kind of surprise me, but look, maybe. Season series. Do you know if there are 2 in Atlanta or 2 in New York out of the 3 games?
I got it.
Important question.
I know they play. I think this is fun. They play the second game of the year, so we're going to get some early input on all of
That's the home opener for the Hawks, I believe. So yeah. Anyway, I think that there's a reason New York has a higher win total than
they get 2
does.
at home, Brad.
Okay, so that makes it harder. If it had been 2 in New York, I would have said New York. I would have said New York 2-1. Man, 2 at home. It's like 50-50 because I feel like the Knicks, regular season wise in particular, are better than the Hawks. It's just that because of the depth they have. New York's, I mean, I know you know this. The depth of the Knicks is impressive. They have 10 guys that you trust. Anyway, I'll say, you know what? I'll be a homer for once in my life. 2-1 Hawks. Everybody wins at home. The most cop-out answer of all time. There you go.
All right, I gotta go because I think I'd be run out of town and maybe tarred and feathered if I said 2-1 Hawks. I'm gonna go 2-1 Knicks for my own safety. Brad Rowland, thank you so much. Before I let you go, can you just tell everyone where they can find all your great work?
Yeah, Locked On Hawks, obviously same places you can find Locked On Knicks. You can find it Locked On Hawks anywhere. Also on Twitter /X, whatever we call that this time of year /millennium, at Locked On Hawks there as well. At BT Rowland for me. And yeah, all the Hawks stuff. Hopefully not too much of a homer. And I can talk about the whole league. I've been doing a whole series on over-unders across the East. So not just Hawks, just 95% Hawks, 5% Eastern Conference and other things. But find us all there. And I'm sure we'll talk again in some other form. I appreciate you.
Yeah, you know what? Knicks Hawks Part 2 would be a movie. I think it would be, especially with Jalen Brunson. We kind of brought a knife to a gunfight last time around. This time it'll be a little bit more even. But for Brad, I'm Gavin Schall. This was Locked On Knicks and Locked On Hawks. We will talk to you all soon.